We've agreed that what we're going to do is 7 minutes for each of my amazing speakers, and then we're going to throw the floor open for a bit of audience participation, as in a question. So, without further ado, we're going to, are we ready? Maestro, with our, we are ready. We're going to go for it.
Greetings to the International Social Forum. This is Naomi Klein, and I wish so much that I could be with you in person, but I hope that this message of solidarity and support suffices. It is so important what you are doing. This is a truly historic moment for us to be meeting across borders to talk about our shared common values and the shared crises that we are up against. Because the crises that we are facing are international at their core, whether it is grotesque economic inequality, whether it is surging tribalism and white supremacy, or whether it is the global climate crisis itself. They are international and they are deeply and fundamentally interconnected, and so must our solutions be as well. We need to tell a story of how we ended up at this perilous moment, a truthful story that tells the truth about the fact that the story of climate change begins with the theft of indigenous land by colonial powers, the theft of African bodies in the transatlantic slave trade, that the excess capital produced by this barbarism is what began the age of fossil fuels, and thus climate change. It opened up massive inequalities that never closed. And in responding to this crisis with a truly global Green New Deal, we have a chance not just to avert catastrophic climate change, which we must, fairer, more humane, more dignified world that values every single human life, that would never imagine allowing thousands of people to drown in the Mediterranean or to sacrifice the futures of young people around the world who are thankfully taking to the streets and taking leadership. We will not stand for this. I wish you great luck in your discussions and deliberations. As we know, the fascist right is interconnected, is global in nature. We know how to build an international movement better than they do, and it's time. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so, I'm delighted. Our first speaker is going to be Tina Ngata. No, it was I thought we agreed. I see, I'm sorry. There's one bloke on this panel, and he wants to challenge my ruling, right? Indeed. So, we agreed beforehand. Tina is speaking first. Tina is a campaigner on human rights, environmental rights, and Indigenous rights. You may have heard her as the Non-Plastic Maori, which is the name of her blog. I know that Tina's going to have some challenging things to say because she was the one who scared me most before we started this session. So I'm just going to hand it over to Tina. And Tina, I've got a clock on you, okay? 7 minutes, as we agreed.
Tēnā hoki koutou katoa. I've travelled for 2 days to get here. My return trip has created, or will create by the time I get home, 4.8 metric tonnes of CO2, which is a lot to create for a 7-minute slot. So I appreciate the invite, and with that in mind, and as they say, time is a coloniser, I will endeavour to make the most of my time with you today, and it's going to require me to be pretty blunt in what I have to say. Yeah, that's true. That's very much true. So, but it's important that we have these really blunt conversations right now, and I wouldn't normally come this far for this much time, but it's because I believe that the conversations here are so important, and because of all nations, You guys have a particularly special role to play in avoiding planetary catastrophe. So over the last 30 years of deliberate focus on reducing emissions, we're now emitting more than ever. 2018 was a global high. The world's governments are struggling to meet their COP commitments, which were already too weak. And the global south, as well as Indigenous peoples all over the world, are paying the price of that failure. So it's well past time for us to consider what we are missing in our discussions and plans to pull the brakes on this destructive trajectory. We are all being economically forced and assimilated into extractive, pollutive systems of food procurement and lifestyles that disconnect us from the implications of our decisions. And we're here today to discuss how to get ourselves out of this trap. For Indigenous peoples, we understand this issue only too well. When you talk about a system that extracts from our world to profit another, and when you talk about a system that spells the end of your way of life, that forces you to worry about your very survival and that of your children and grandchildren, that impacts upon your food systems, your bodies, your human rights, well, Indigenous peoples understand that experience very well. We call it colonisation and imperial entitlement. And we're all now stuck in an abusive relationship with our planet. And just like any abusive relationship, if you want to break your patterns of behaviour, you need to understand where your patterns of behaviour come from. That's a task for us all, but I have to say, for Britain, it's going to be hard because you need to come to terms with where this imperial entitlement has come from and what your role has been in this pattern. It's not going to be an easy healing journey for you, but you can't delay it any further. If you want to create an architecture for a climate just economy, there is a reckoning that needs to take place here. The psyche of corporate imperial entitlement that besets our planet has a heritage, and that heritage is in this land. So decolonisation has been a big part of the discussion on climate justice for a little while now, and we've seen it rise up in the movements of Standing Rock in relation to the Alberta tar sands and in our own territories as well. We have just finished chasing off the fourth oil and gas company from our oceanic territory along the east coast of Aotearoa. Thank you. It was colonial law that ushered them into our territories, and it was our application and insistence on Indigenous law that cast them out of our territories. We are consistently, as Indigenous peoples, pointing out the contribution of our territories and our practices to climate mitigation. We hold 80% of the world's biodiversity in our territories. We have sequestered 30 times the global CO2 emissions in our Indigenous managed forest systems, but we are still being hunted. We're still being assassinated, we're still being criminalised and imprisoned by our settler colonial governments for protecting those same surviving territories from exploitation. And I want to know, what's Britain going to do about that? Because you've had a role in the setup of those systems. What upsets me when I consider all of this is that it's always the assumed job of Indigenous peoples to drive decolonisation of lands, mines, economies. In fact, it's everybody's responsibility to understand their role in this and figure out how they will dismantle and deconstruct their own paradigms of imperial entitlement. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a flu. There are concrete things that you can do right now to start redeeming this story. You can start with decolonising your trade deals. Incorporate the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You incorporate ISDS into your trade deals. Incorporate the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into your trade deals. Start holding your trade partners accountable for how those relationships are going to impact upon Indigenous bodies and territories. There are many other things that you can be doing as well. You can stand up as a powerful nation with some powerful bros and start to demand equitable Indigenous involvement in climate talks and climate action instead of shutting us out from the table. If you want to recreate an economic architecture for climate justice, and if you really want to do that, this is what it's going to take. Nothing less than a complete, full account of climate injustice and its roots in imperial entitlement. That stands true for domestic cases as much as it does for global cases as well. Global politics, even at the United Nations level, has been responsible for the carving up and dispossession of Indigenous territories. And you guys also have a role in that. So you need to recognise when colonial entitlement is in play, you need to know what it looks like as a food system, as an energy system, as an economy, as a trade deal, and as a government. You guys aren't there yet. And I know this because Indigenous peoples of the world whose territories were taken mostly by Britain in the first instance are still awaiting an apology and acknowledgement of that fact. In my country, the government is reenacting your invasion of our lands that happened 250 years ago this year. And in that story, you guys are the abusers. It's the actions of Britain that are being reenacted there. What are you guys going to do about it? Imperial entitlement can't be sanctioned or endorsed or re-entrenched anymore. It wasn't okay in 1769. It's not okay in 2019. I can indigenize my world and my home and the worlds of my daughters as much as possible, but that's not going to change who holds the power here. We all know who holds the power and who needs to make the changes. So those of you who retain your white-knuckled grip on power, you guys aren't the ones that are making the good decisions here. You're not the ones with the living memory of how to nourish this planet. You're not the ones who are retaining 80% of the world's biodiversity. You're not the ones who are sequestering the majority of the carbon. Indigenous peoples are. We claim customarily 50% of this world's territories. Legally, we only hold title to 10%.
1 minute.
And there's a story in that, and you guys are a part of that story. So what are you going to do about it today? No more washing your hands of the legacy of colonization. We don't get to do that. We have to live with that legacy in our face every day. The planet doesn't get to do that anymore, and Britain shouldn't have to do that anyway. So I'm hopeful that these discussions will include the way in which you will take up that responsibility. I'm hopeful that you will take some action with some of your global bros and stand by us and with us as we fight for the return of our territories, because that's what we want. We want our lands back so that we can get about creating these sanctuaries that provide the model for sustainable development that the world needs right now, so that we can increase the amount of carbon being sunk into our forests, so that we can increase the amount of biodiversity that this world has. You have a role in this story, and it's time for you to step up to your healing journey. We're all waiting for you to do it. Tēnā te.
I don't want anybody here to think I got soft on the stopwatch. I didn't. But I've just been told that we're missing one of our speakers today. So I redistributed the time allocation. So we now have 10 minutes each. So at 9 minutes, I will firmly say into my microphone, 1 minute. And at 10 minutes, I will say, thank you. Okay, good. Which one of the two of you would like to go next? Okay. Holly's going next. Holly. Holly's a science fellow at the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at the University of California. She researches, she writes, she speaks about how communities can be involved in the design of emerging environmental technologies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here and talk with you all about something that's really terrifying, the climate crisis. I'm excited because we're finally possibly at a social tipping point where we can recognize it as a crisis, which is huge. And I'm going to go very rapidly through this because it's a 14-minute talk, and compressing it, there might be gaps, so please come talk to me, email me if there's gaps, and I can try to fill them in. We all know that climate change has reached a crisis point, so I'm not going to spend very much time reviewing where we're at 2019 and why I think the use of the term emergency is justifiable. This is the emissions gap. Even if nations do fulfill pledges made in the Paris Agreement, that's 3 degrees of warming, we're still headed towards 4. With 4 degrees, picture the Sahara expanding into southern Europe, the Amazon possibly tipping into a savanna ecosystem, Bangladesh losing 1/3 of its land area, 2/3 of glacier mass in Asia disappearing. These are no longer climate problems, they're economic, health, spiritual problems. And so there's 50 gigatons of CO2 emissions now, equivalent. And a gigaton is 1 billion tons. Greenhouse gas emissions also show no signs of peaking, and we really need to not just level them off, we need to bend the curve down right now. So here's a potential carbon budget, the amount of carbon that can be burned before the world reaches 2 degrees. So each year, say 40 gigatons of CO2 are emitted. That's not even counting methane and other greenhouse gases. Each year we're spending that much out of this budget. And so in less than a decade, more than 1/3 of that has been blown through. By 2042, it's spent out. Plus there's some uncertainty here, right? So the carbon budget could actually be a bit smaller. And the point is the clock is really running down to deal with this. So why are we failing? I mean, we could spend an entire course on this. I have one. And I've got less than 10 minutes now. So in my view, the regime can't cope because its members, the nation states, aren't functioning well because of capitalism. The UN talks a lot about strengthening ambition on the part of nation states. There's several things preventing that. And so with this last point, decarbonization is really hard. It's not just enough to grow clean energy supply. We have to actually talk about how we're going to decrease the dirty energy supply. And this is a thing that the Paris Agreement and our international architecture isn't doing very well on. So what do we do about it? There's a lot to say about mitigation and adaptation. These are international concerns. The Global North has the responsibility to contribute to funding them everywhere. But I'm also going to talk with my time with 3 other things that are less discussed. The first, as I mentioned, is that what to do with the fossil fuel industry is a question for all of us. We don't really have a unified vocabulary yet about how to think about it. Manage decline, phase out, supply constraints, a global just transition might be a good one. And one of the things that makes this so challenging is that most oil extraction is done by national oil companies. So it's not just a matter of putting multinationals out of business. There's international negotiation that will be needed. And we also need to develop an idea of what these companies can become, since they're so entangled with civil governments everywhere. And I think that some of these companies, some of the cutting edge ones, are looking towards becoming carbon removal services companies, or at the least positioning themselves to use the rhetoric of carbon removal to continue to legitimate their operations. So let me explain a little bit more about that. You may have heard that scenarios for reaching 1.5 degrees rely upon removing hundreds of gigatons of CO2 from the air. This is from the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees. they talk about 100 to 1,000 gigatons over this century. So the 2-degree scenario basically looks like this. This is from the Royal Society's Greenhouse Gas Removal Report. First, notice that this curve bends down sharply, the most striking thing about it, right? But also, near the end of the century, there's this point of net negative greenhouse gas emissions, where the world is removing more carbon than is being emitted. These numbers of removals are huge. The median in these models that are used by the IPCC modeling community is about -10, so removing 10 billion tons every year. And that's a thing that needs to start right away to achieve that. That infrastructure needs to be designed and planned and built out. And so this is coming to the attention of policymakers in the US and elsewhere. How can carbon be removed from the atmosphere? There are a number of ways: storing it in natural ecosystems or capturing it industrially and injecting it underground for storage. You may have heard of many of these methods. People look at this and they think, can't we just use the natural methods that we know work and have been doing? Natural climate solutions are fantastic. One thing I want to point out about them, though, is that after a while, these carbon sinks get full. You plant the trees, you reform your farming practices to put more carbon in the soil, and then you have to store the carbon there. And so year on year, the amount you can do with those will level off after a few decades. And so imagine if the world did that in earnest and over 50 years managed to sequester 200 gigatons with natural climate solutions. That's a lot. We're talking about foresting a land area about the size of the US. And so eventually we'd run out of land to do that on. But all of that work would only buy us 5 years of emissions at our current rate. 5 years of delay, another bad presidential term, basically. And then we've used up that natural storage capacity. So I'm very alarmed about this, and that's why I'm talking also about industrial carbon capture. There's basically two ideas that would get the world to those 10 gigaton levels at the end of the century. One of these is bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. I'm sure everybody here can imagine continuing forms of colonialism involved with the land demands for this. Direct air capture machines that suck carbon from the air, and then this captured carbon needs to be stored underground. All of this needs to be powered by renewables if it's going to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. But I would also say don't just discount this technology, because in principle, it could allow one country with a lot of responsibility historically, like the US, to remove emissions. So, so there's a climate justice possibility here that basically nobody is discussing, because the people coming up with these, the first commercial plant that's planned is serving the world's largest market for captured CO2, which happens to be enhanced oil recovery. So this is something that's been done since the 70s, and there's a number of pipelines in the US for transporting this CO2. Right now it's mined from natural sources in Colorado, piped to West Texas, injected into depleted oil wells to force more oil out. And now what we're starting to hear from companies is that if you get the CO2 from the atmosphere or from biomass and you inject as much as you can into the well, then the oil you get out would actually be carbon negative. You can see how this might not go well. But okay, so here's the points. Our models are indicating a massive waste disposal project with new infrastructure on the order of the scale of the existing fossil fuel industry, but to put carbon back underground. B, the best plan that capitalism has for accomplishing this involves producing more oil. And C, we actually still do have to do something with these fossil fuel companies. And this is not going to happen, without global coordination, international cooperation, industrial policy. I don't see any evidence that capitalism is capable of a cleanup project at the scale. Okay, thank you. There's so much here.
I know.
Yeah, and this next thing is even more daunting. So because building out that carbon removal infrastructure is so daunting and mitigation has been too slow to arrive, some scientists are researching whether putting particles into the stratosphere could cool the planet and buy time to scale that up. I'm not going to talk about this in detail because of time, but this idea involves intentionally putting particles into the stratosphere using airplanes, probably. These particles circulate around the globe for a year or two. They block 1% to 2% of incoming sunlight in the models. So I'm raising this because we have to be aware that by using the language of crisis and emergency, it opens the door to these kinds of proposals. So we have to be really careful about how we talk about the climate crisis. So, and be ready to hear that this is cheap, be ready to hear it conflated with adaptation. I think we need to really engage with these ideas in an anticipatory way. This kind of scheme would not return us to a prior climate, but if you're a scientist looking at models, it can seem better than the worst case climate change scenarios. Tons of negative impacts, I don't want to skip them. If we don't engage early with this, that's a big problem.
I know it's really tough to speakers, and I'm so sorry, and I'm now getting another note, which is always welcome right in the middle of a session. Anyway, my last but by no means least speaker, because he comes from West Ham, and that makes him a dead good bloke, is Asad Rehman, who is the Executive Director of War on One. And he's previously worked with Amnesty International, Global Justice Now, and as the head of international climate at Friends of the Earth.
Thank you. Okay, 10 minutes. I'm going to try and speed the way through this. So you've heard a little bit about the science, and of course the IPCC report that came out in October sent a bit of shockwaves through the civil society in the global north, led to lots of different things happening, as we know. But you know, that report, of course, is the summary policymakers report is negotiated by consensus. So that's the most conservative reading in terms of that. I mean, the reality, of course, is the difference between the 1.5 and the 2 degrees are the equivalent of about a 9/11 disaster each and every day for the next 70 years. But of course, happening in the global south, so we'll never know the names and stories of those people, and we'll be happy to sacrifice them. So when people took away that takeaway from the IPCC and said 12 years to save humanity, I personally find that quite distasteful, because actually the global south has long been sacrificed. And when people talk about we have to take action on climate change to save our children and grandchildren, of course what we're basically saying is that there are people who are actually dying now in the global south. Their lives don't really matter, and the scale of the impacts are immense, right? In Pakistan, where I'm originally from, we've had a heat wave last year of 53.5 degrees centigrade. You heard earlier about the impacts in India. We've had Chennai run out of water. We've got people now talking about 40% of India's population of 1.3 billion people could be without access to fresh water by 2040. You've all saw the pictures of course, the cyclone in Mozambique, you know, destroying a port city, left 1 million people on the brink of starvation. Why? Because, of course, it's not simply about climate change. It's been the fact that Mozambique was a colonial country. It was systematically destroyed both by imperialist wars and by structural adjustment programs, so much so that when the climate impacts happened, Mozambique government came here to the City of London and had to ask for debt-creating loans to be able to deal with the impacts out there. And of course, this has been the reality. Now, you know, we've got the climate talks coming next year, and I want to say a little bit about the climate talks first. You know, when you look back and you think about the 1992 Climate Convention, the climate treaty, it looks absolutely fabulous on paper. It said, you know, the polluters pay, i.e. those countries most responsible have to take action, historical responsibility. You have to be responsible for all of your emissions, and of course that developing countries were dealing with two challenges: one, the climate crisis, but also dealing with poverty. Now, we know climate change is fundamentally a problem of the global commons, and that response, the only response to it, has to be both fair and equitable. And one of the problems, and I think when people looked at the climate talks, is that they thought it was about the environment or about climate change. It's never been about climate change. It's always been about political economy. It's always been a question about rich countries systematically protecting their political economy against developing countries. Some people have said it's about empire. Empire is the rich developed countries in a struggle against their former colonial countries in terms of trying to struggle for political space. And that's been the case. And it's not just been about Trump. Obama before him, Bush before him have all been leading this attempt to do this. And that's why we've seen this dismantling of the climate architecture. And it's been systematic. Now, of course, climate change has been on the agenda, or as I said, recently, but it was on the agenda about a decade ago. You might remember Obama got a Nobel Prize for going to Copenhagen. And of course, lots of Western governments and NGOs at the time all called for, we're going to limit temperature levels to 2 degrees. Now remember that the global movements in the South and countries in the global South actually talked about limited temperatures to well below 1 degree. And in fact, they talked about it because they talked about what that would mean in terms of their impacts. Now the ambassador of the G77 at the time, Ambassador Lumumba, talked in the Copenhagen talks. He said that what was being proposed by developed countries was going to unleash a holocaust on the people of Africa. And he said that the sums of money that rich developed countries were putting on the table wouldn't even pay for the coffins of the people that would die. And of course, there was huge uproar. How dare you use the word holocaust to that? Now we actually see that the reality of what is actually happening in terms of climate impacts pales into insignificance. And yet in Paris, we saw everybody, rich countries plus NGOs, all celebrating this agreement, this empty agreement which is going to lead to at least 3 degrees warming and anything up to 7 degrees of warming. And what had happened? They dismantled the architecture. So we had no science-based targets, we had no legally binding targets. Rich countries had shifted their responsibility for paying for climate mitigation and adaptation onto poorer countries. And it basically had continued the model of neoliberalism. And so for me, the problem of the climate talks has never been about the multilateral process. It's always been a question about power. And the issue of power operates at both at a national and a global level. Now, of course, one of the things that neoliberalism has done is assault the very forces of social transformation, including the labour movement, and weakened it at the very moment when we actually needed it. But it also weakened the idea of internationalism, so much so that the climate movement, as we know, the ones you think would be at the forefront, were talking about what? Empty slogans, talking for people to act on climate change. Well, all those governments are saying that they're acting on climate change. It was so easy to co-opt. And what did they say to people? It said, it's so emergency, but I need you to change a light bulb. Stop buying straws. Don't buy a plastic bag. Of course, it was all about individual consumer behaviour. Responsibility was pushed back on us. It was always a question about systems, but they were too scared to talk about that this was a systemic problem. So much so that 2 weeks ago, when the UK government, of course, adopted the net zero by 2050, which is an absolutely outrageous death sentence to the poor, what happened when the civil society did their lobby? They call for net zero by 2045. Now, the reality is rich countries need to be decarbonised by 2030 so that poorer countries can decarbonise by 2050 if we want to keep temperatures well below 1.5. The scale of the responsibility, we have to be truthful about it. And that means we have to say, where do we stand? And now you've all heard this figure, 10% of the population responsible for 50% of global emissions, same 50%, and the poorest 50% are responsible for only 10%. But we've got to overlay this with, of course, all the other inequalities that we face. We face a half of the world's population, 3.5 billion people surviving on less than $5 a day. We've got 2 billion people going hungry. We've got 3 billion people without access to energy. And of course, and about 3.5 people without water stress. So when we talk about climate change, you can't move climate change without talking about inequality. And that talks us also, of course, about the inevitable consequence of neoliberalism. Now, but the answer to this, well, some people seem to be saying that the answer to this is a return to Keynesianism. That's all we need to do. If it was terrible, this neoliberalism, we can stimulate some consumer demand, we can promote economic growth, and everything will be all right. Well, in reality, it potentially will be. What we'll have is, of course, social democracy in the global north and neo-colonial globalization in the global south, because that is simply impossible when we talk about the limits that the environmental crisis put on us. So what do we need? We actually, as John said, we have to rediscover and reimagine a new internationalism. It has to be an anti-imperialist. It has to recognize that the shape of our societies in the global north stem back to the Enlightenment and the doctrine of discovery, which both said there's a hierarchy of races, right? The Caucasians are at the top. All these people in the global south are unwillingly to be sacrificed. If we don't understand that, we don't understand how slavery took place, how colonialism took place, why the wars of imperialism took place in the 1970s, and why neoliberalism has been successfully able to sacrifice people in the global south for decades. And of course, now citizens of the global north have woken up because they think it's going to impact them. But they were happy to continue that model of economy when it was just simply leaving the global south. Now, the reality is, of course, that the wealth of our countries are also based on that. When Britain went to India, and I say my comrades here, you know, India's share of the global GDP was 24.4%. When Britain left, it was 4.2%. It's calculated that Britain took $10 trillion from India alone, let alone anywhere else in the third of the world that they'd occupied. That in itself now would be worth 45 trillion. The reality, of course, is that there's an approach to dealing with the climate change which models the approach to dealing with slavery. Britain, how it dealt with slavery. If you remember, Britain dealt with slavery, at least it carried on profiting from slavery everywhere else in the world, but it made slavery illegal here in the UK by, of course, allocating 40% of its GDP. Of its national budget. We ended up as taxpayers paying that off in 2015. Did that go to the slaves? No, of course not. It went to the slave owners, the richest families in Britain, and you know one of them, but his name was former Prime Minister David Cameron. Now, the reality, of course, is that the climate change has actually been good for rich developed countries. Norway's economy has grown by 34%. India and Nigeria have taken a hit of about 30% because of the climate crisis. And we have to take responsibility. Just down the road, of course, is the City of London. 22% of our country's GDP comes from that City of London. A third of all the values of the shares on there flow from extractives. The fossil fuel shares on the London Stock Exchange, just alone, are worth more than the entire GDP of sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, our banks and the banks around the world continue to invest about 1.9 trillion in dirty energy infrastructure, even since the Paris Agreement. But all of our consumption model has always been built on extraction of resources and wealth from the global south. Right, 60% of the land that we use currently comes from outside of the European Union. 40% of all the materials that we use currently come outside of the European Union. So when people talk about a Green Deal, absolutely, it's a beginning. But what it cannot do, it is not only the answer. The answer has to be a global deal for people. And the first part of that has got to be that the UK must recognise its fair share. So the UK's fair share, minus 200% by 2030. That, of course, is impossible for it to do, which means huge transfer of scale of resources, finance and technology. Do we hear any mention of that? It has to be a central part of our thing, because what we're asking is poorer countries to take on the responsibility to cut the emissions that we no longer can cut our emissions. We have to also say no to the wave of green colonialism. This idea we can just simply green our economy by using renewable energy. Where do you think the rare earth and minerals and metals are going to come from? Are we going to unleash a new wave of green colonialism where behind every ton of extraction lies a story of environmental destruction, human rights violations, pollution? But also there are limits to it. If you just take, for example, the UK's electricity cars target by 2050, it would take 2 times all of the cobalt that's currently been produced in the world, 3/4 of all the lithium production, and half of the copper production. It is simply not possible. And that's one of the things that what's actually happened is neoliberalism has killed our imagination. It's killed our imagination to imagine a society, an economy that is not built on that. We have to do that. What can you do? We can have to talk about energy as a public good, not owned by private corporations at all, from extraction to delivery. We have to talk about the right to food. I'm going to, 30 seconds, we're going to be the right to food. We've got to end financial...
Break the rules, come and sit down.
No, I've got... But I was going to give you the whole.
So, I'm now looking to see how many minutes I'm allowed to have. I'm allowed to have 10 minutes. So can we keep the questions short and tell us who you would like to answer the question? Because that way we might be able to keep some rein on this. Can I also say that you're going to lose your lunch break, so you're going to have to pick up your lunch on the way to the seminar. Okay, is everybody okay with that? Cool. First question, brother at the back. Yeah, that's you.
David Hillman from Stamp Out Poverty. Asad, can you give us your conclusions, please?
unity in this room, I can see. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Well, first of all, I'd say focus on simply tax and subsidies is like trying to stop Hitler with a fascism tax. I think we need to talk about a climate emergency act in the UK that puts 1.5 at the centre, fair shares in inequality, guarantees everybody a right to a dignified life, makes right to food, ending financial speculation on food production here, says on migration, 1 billion people is likely to be forced on the move. The majority will never end up in the global north, but people have the right to move. But more importantly, they have the right not to move. What does that mean? That means we have to guarantee people universal public services, health, education, housing. We have to have a global living wage. We have to force all multinationals to be able to do that. We have to have a basic income. But of course, and that means then out of that, we start to think about all the other global architecture, trade, WTO, IPRs, etc. Is it possible? Absolutely. Is it financially viable? Absolutely. Do we lack the political will? Yes. Do we lack the imagination? And hopefully at the end of these 2 days, we're not going to have the end that. The solutions are all there. We have to simply be able to demand them.
Thank you. Mr. down there.
One of the previous speakers spoke about sustainable development. Could a comment be, can development ever be sustainable?
Ooh. Who spoke about sustainable development? Was that you, Holly? Or I think we all did. Holly?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Next question.
No.
Brother there.
I think it has a limit. You know, we have to be realistic. It has a limit. You can't keep on going in that direction and expect to never fall off. You know?
Brother there.
My name's Paul Santo. If we all take one task that we can do today, what is that one task? Anyone on the panel, thanks.
Let's take it in turns.
Sure. Join us in the fight to return Indigenous lands back to Indigenous peoples. We've been responsible for a huge amount of climate mitigation. We're your best bet.
Okay.
There is huge resistance in the Global South. The question people always ask in the Global South is, where is the movement standing with them about the banks and corporations which are driving the climate crisis and the crisis of inequality? So there's one thing we can do is to take on the power, and we're in the belly of the beast, and take on those multinationals on behalf of and stand in solidarity with the Global South.
This is going to sound so weak compared to what my colleagues have said, but there's been a lot of research lately about how just talking to other people about climate change helps the whole concern grow. So have a conversation, you know, have 5 conversations, especially with people that you wouldn't normally talk to about this.
Mr. Bear.
Hello, Laura Bassi from Open Democracy. Following on from the sustainable development question, what kinds of development model could be sustainable?
Should we go in the opposite direction? Holly?
I think there's just so much to be said about, I think there's a way that degrowth can be compatible with some of the emerging technologies that we're seeing, and that they could be used in ways that are compatible with degrowth goals. But I have too much jet lag and not enough time to articulate them, but I'd love to talk with you all about it.
It used to be a slogan of the anti-globalization, yeah? One no, many yeses. And I think that's the reality, that there are going to be many, many different development models, which will be peculiar to each local and regional circumstance. Now, the reality, of course, is, you know, in the global north, I don't like the word degrowth. I think it tells totally the wrong story. I think we've got to talk about a better economy, not less. We should be actually talking about a life and a society in a totally different way. But I think we can guarantee some fundamentals. And of course, that does mean that people in the global south do need and should have the right to all of these rights, which of course, when I say them, sound madly radical. Remember that they were all guaranteed 71 years ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was not seen as a radical document. I think it's us thinking about those and then thinking, how do we get there in terms of the development? And I think you asked Kate was asked about the first question about the sustainable development, which I think is about the SDGs. Nobody links to the SDGs. Well, isn't the sustainable development goals a way to be able to achieve that? The problem is, of course, the model of how you achieve that. If the model is still the neoliberal model, still continues the same dynamics of inequality and economic exploitation, then no matter what goals you set at the end, actually we'll never meet them.
Yeah. I think, you know, when you bring up the SDGs, we've had a lot of discussion around what it would look like for us to be living in a space, living the SDGs, right? And when people describe what that society would look like, it sounds a lot to me like what my ancestors lived like anyway. And so, so again, I think we need to have these, one, localized economies. We can't have these centralized economies where people a million miles away from a water source are making decisions about what's in the best interest of the water source and the people who live on it. We need to make sure that there's a greater sense of connection between the resources that are being controlled and the people who live around those resources. So localized economies, I love this idea that I was listening to earlier around economic zones, rural economic zones, so that you can nurture these spaces for the people who have led this type of lifestyle to be able to continue and develop that kind of lifestyle as a model for the rest of the world. As I said before, I think, you know, a lot of colonial countries, it's so far back in your lived memory where you lived in harmony with Mother Earth that it's very difficult for you to grasp that vision and set your trajectory in that direction. Indigenous peoples are still living that reality today. So those places need to be fostered.
At the back. And then I've got one at the back there, and then I think I'm going to let you go off for lunch. Well, to collect your lunch on your way to your next bit.
Hi. I just want to listen to Tina speak all day. But I was wondering if you could tell me so thank you so much for everything you said. I think it was really, really needed. And I was wondering what gives you hope. And also I'd like to know what you need. And by you, I mean you and the people you organize with and fight with.
Me? Yeah, okay. So like I said, we just chased out the fourth oil and gas company out of our region. That gives me hope. People told us we would never be able to do that. We were like one tiny little tribe, 70,000 people, and we chased out Tag Oil, Petrobras, Chevron, and Statoil through applying Indigenous law, through living our Indigenous truth. So when we have those wins, that gives me hope. Yeah.
Oh, are you asking everybody?
Yeah.
What gives me hope? Absolutely. What gives me hope is the resistance in the global south, is the actual fight that's taking place every single day all around the world. Not just in terms of against extraction, but the right to a living wage, the right to a dignified life, the right for migration rights. The hope is of building an intersectional movement that's rooted and accountable in the global south, but has the vision and acts in concert again between the north and the south. I think the beginnings are there. That's what's beginning to give me hope.
I feel hope because pretty much everybody I've ever met doesn't want to live in a hellscape. They want a better world for themselves and their children. And I think that if we can just harness this joint intention, I think that, you know, social systems aren't linear. There's tipping points where things can flip, and maybe we're at one, and if we're not, we need to get it there.
And our final question is the brother at the back. Right at the back.
So this question is to Asad. So from a specific point of view of Pakistan, I have seen that there's a growing concern of clean water sources. And by 2050, at least, I think, around 200 million people will be affected by not having clean water to drink. How does the fight against climate change combine to actually give us a solution to that problem? Because as I've seen happen, to actually fight it, there are more concerns that we are actually lending towards having less water sources going forward.
Yeah. So I think, one of the problems, of course, for the whole of the Indian subcontinent is this duality of extreme heat wave and then, of course, which is leading to the melting of the glaciers, which is, of course, creating huge flooding and then ultimately water scarcity. Now, how do we do that? Well, I think, again, we have to guarantee the right to water. I mean, in so many places, it's not simply how much water, it's who has the right to water. And what we're seeing again and again, we're just, in fact, this weekend, working on a case in Colombia with communities there, where they've diverted the river for the coal industry. And in a drought-affected area, and leaving indigenous communities basically without access to fresh water. And so I think it means a fundamental rethinking. And what you see in Pakistan is this duality of what the Pakistan government thinks we must have economic development. And economic development means sacrificing some part of our poorer population. And if they don't have access to water, well, that's simply an inevitable cost of it. Rather than us thinking, what is development? What right do we give to absolutely everybody, and how do we build up from that? So it means a different looking at the economy. It's the only way that we're going to be able to protect water.